In this lecture, we're going to look closer at the waves of Jewish immigrants that arrived in Ottoman Palestine. What were the differences between these different waves? Why did they come here? And how did they contribute to the emerging culture that ultimately coalesced into the nation of Israel? The population of Palestine shifted from Arab Muslims to Jewish following waves of Jewish immigrants, most of whom were fleeing persecution in Europe, the Middle East, and Russia. After we go through this lecture, you'll understand how the demographics of the Middle East have shifted so dramatically and why Jews have flocked to a place surrounded by what could be conceived of as unfriendly neighbors. First, just a little bit of demographic information. 100 years ago, there was barely one Jew for every 100 Muslims in modern-day Israel. By 1918, the number had jumped to 1 in 10, and by 1948, the population was roughly even. So, what caused such an abrupt demographic shift? Well, it was a massive influx of Jews that was too large-scale and haphazard to be centrally planned, along with the emigration and deportation of Muslim inhabitants of this area. It's interesting to note that when the first wave of Jewish settlers arrived, who were inspired by Theodor Herzl and the World Zionist Congress that were pushing to have the resettlement of the global Jewish population within historical Israel, when this first wave arrived in the late 19th century, they never imagined that the end result would be an independent nation. This wasn't the original goal. Instead, they hoped to occupy a semi-autonomous region under the umbrella of the Ottoman Muslim Turks, which had housed Jews escaping the Spanish Inquisition 400 years earlier. Interestingly, Theodor Herzl even personally petitioned Sultan Abdülhamid II for this request in Istanbul, and he was flat out rejected. Abdülhamid was very keen on consolidating his power in the Arab provinces, and he did a lot to project an image as the protector of Islam. And also he had a view of the Arab provinces not too different from how European colonists looked at it. He wanted to culturally lift up the region and take the people from backwardness to the more enlightening civilization of what he perceived Ottoman Turkish civilization to be. All that to say, he wasn't keen on this request. It should also be noted that amongst the Muslim inhabitants of the region, there wasn't really an idea of a Palestinian identity. Yes, there is a linguistic attachment, Philistine, to the region, but the way Palestinian nationalism is conceived of today isn't what existed at this time. So I want to underline that fact. But what was interesting is when Herzl petitioned Abdülhamid for the settlement is that what he and other Jewish leaders couldn't accomplish in bringing Jews to Palestine would actually be achieved in the decades to come by rising anti-Semitism. As Jews throughout Eastern Europe fled their homelands, many went to America, but a few others, with no place to go, and hearing of this effort by the World Zionist Congress, came to Israel. Let's look at some of the characteristics of the early immigrants. The first immigrants escaped Russia and Eastern European pogroms, as we talked about in the last lecture. They considered immigrating to Israel a tenet of Zionist ideology and described the act of returning to their homeland with the Hebrew word Aliyah, which means ascent. This idea goes back to actually the first wave of Jewish migrants, not in the modern period, but when Jews were deported from their homelands in biblical times and taken into the Babylonian Empire as captivity. And after the Babylonians were conquered by the Persians and the Persians permitted a number of Jews to return to Jerusalem, this idea of Aliyah, returning to homeland, comes about, in which different waves of Jews go back, they rebuild the city walls and rebuild a Jewish state. So this is the idea coming into focus. And these different Aliyahs, these different waves of immigrants, have different characteristics. The first is known as the farmer's Aliyah, and they're mostly Jews who are escaping the Eastern European pogroms. They were artisans and small tradesmen, although it's called the Farmers' Aliyah because many of them set up agricultural establishments. Most settlers, despite creating settlements, were not proficient in farming. But this was a job that they had to do because Palestine at the time had very little industry built up, so that's the trade that one had to turn to. It went from 1882 to 1903. There were approximately 35,000 Jews who arrived in Ottoman Syria, and like I said, they established agricultural communities since that was the major industry. The second and third Aliyahs lasted from 1904 to 1923, particularly after World War I. There are interesting characteristics of this one. Most of the members of this wave were idealists who were inspired by the revolutionary ideas sweeping Russia. They wanted to have communal agricultural settlements. Another interesting thing is that it's at this time in the second and third Aliyahs that you see the revival of the Hebrew language. In a lot of the schools and educational institutions being set up at this time, there's a favor for reviving ancient Hebrew and using it as a spoken and reading language, as opposed to Yiddish, which was more common amongst Jews at this time. This is the first and only widespread example in history of an ancient language that had become mostly dead, and Hebrew at this time was only interest amongst scholars or those studying the Talmud or others interested in ancient Near Eastern languages. But it slowly becomes revived and it becomes a language of reading and eventually a spoken language in everyday communications within Israel. This is the first example we see. So Hebrew, of course, is spoken in modern-day Israel, but it's not as if it existed as a spoken living language from ancient Israel until today. In fact, Jews largely stopped speaking Hebrew after the Babylonian captivity. So when you get into early Christianity, amongst the Jews, the common language is Aramaic. This is the language that Jesus and his disciples spoke to one another, not Hebrew. Hebrew is known amongst the scholars and other clerics and religious leaders. So for a language to be taken from disuse for 2,500 years and to come back into use is very interesting. After this, we get into the next Aliyahs. In the fourth and fifth, result from Jews escaping growing anti-Semitism in Hungary, Poland, and Germany. A total of 350,000 arrive, with half that number arriving from 1933 to 1936, escaping the growing effects of the Nazi Party in Europe. Other Jews who survived the Holocaust came after the end of World War II. Eventually, the anti-Jewish sentiment of Europe made its way to the Middle East, where it created enough unrest to compel Jews from communities which had existed in Arab countries for thousands of years to leave their homes for a new homeland as well. So from the post-World War II period to the early 1970s, around 900,000 Jews left Arab lands through immigration or expulsion. Again, many came to the United States or Europe, but some came to Israel. We also see the Jewish population of the Ottoman Empire, now modern-day Turkey, also largely leaving. Istanbul used to have a major Jewish population, numbering tens of thousands. Nowadays, it's been whittled down to a fraction of what it used to be in modern-day Istanbul. So the whirlwind of 20th century Jewish resettlement lasted for 6 decades, but through this demographic transformation of this Ottoman province of Greater Syria and the geographical region of Palestine, through this massive influx of Jewish immigrants, we see it resulting in the creation of a Jewish homeland. In the next section, we're going to look at the specific political events that lead to Israel's formation. We saw the demographic transformation, but it's not enough that people are simply emigrating to Israel. There's also a question of how did it actually form politically, and how did it do this in the midst of this very tumultuous time in the fallout of World War I, and who are the people who supported the creation of a Jewish homeland, and who are the people who opposed it? And we're going to look at that in the next lecture.